Shalom. This week's parasha is Acharei. I'd like to discuss one aspect that happens according to our current calendar. Our minhag is that we usually read this parasha during the springtime. Most years after Passover, some years just before Passover, especially in leap years, or sometimes right around Passover. And this week's parasha happens to be read also almost in its entirety, according to our practice, on Yom Kippur. That is, about every 6 months or so we read this parasha. The difference is that when it's a Shabbat, like we're going to do soon, we read the entire parasha in its entirety in one reading. Whereas on Yom Kippur, the first half of the parasha or so is read in the morning, and the latter section is read in the afternoon, and there's a middle section, the shortest part, which is skipped over entirely. That is not read on Yom Kippur. I like to make a connection between the beginning part, the first part, and the latter part. The first part of the parasha is actually quite relevant to Yom Kippur. It's explicit. It is the description of the temple service that was performed by the Kohen Gadol and the Kohen Gadol himself every Yom Kippur. Apparently, it says, after Moshe Rabbeinu gave this commandment to Aharon, who was the Kohen Gadol, it says he performed it. That is, they were already performing this within in the first year after setting up the Mishkan. This was already done in the desert, which is unique because they did not do, for example, certain korbanot in the desert. Korban Pesach was only done in Egypt right before the Exodus and a year afterwards. But after that, they only did the Korban Pesach once they got to the land of Israel. And they also have, according to many opinions, there were many korbanot that only came into play once the Jewish people got to the land of Israel. But here it says explicitly that Aaron did as Moshe Rabbeinu had commanded him. And this involves entering the Holy of Holies, the only time of the year, although according to how the Chayei Adam described it in the name of his Mechutan, the Vilna Gaon, technically speaking, Aaron could have performed the part of the service that is not specific to the day of Yom Kippur, the whole ritual with the certain chataot and the thing with the sa'ir, etc. He performed the service that did not involve the additional offerings for Yom Kippur described in Pinchas. That's the Parashat Pinchas, and then he could enter the Holy of Holies. Whereas Moshe Rabbeinu, for example, was allowed to enter whenever God commanded him to do so, because he's the prophet and God commands him to enter, so he must enter. And Aaron basically atones for the sins that the people had committed in the year that has passed. He first atones for his own sins, and then for those of his whole family, and then for the entire group of the Kohanim, and then for the entire Jewish people. And that is a lesson for the past. So Kappara, atonement, is from a word is to purge. When, for example, we kosher kalim, we have a pot that was used for non-kosher food, and a Jewish person wants to use it now to cook kosher food. Or Passover is coming, and he's used to boiling his bread in a pot, and now he wants to be able to use that pot on Passover. So he has to purge the pot from the tastes that had been absorbed previously. That is a similar language in the original Hebrew to what happens when people atone for sin. They have to go through a process. So most of the time, it's a sacrificial process that purges the sin from the soul of the person. And it does not say anywhere in this week's parasha, the entire reading, about receiving blessing for the year to come. We connect Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur with each other. We talk about in Rosh Hashanah that we pray that God grant us a good year. The 3 books are opened, and God writes, there's the tzaddikim and the middle of the road people, and there's the Rishayim and the book of life and the book of death. Yom Kippur is connected to that because for the Jewish people, they get a chance to atone for their sins so that they can be inscribed in the book of life. But that is not in this week's parsha. This week's parsha, literal reading, only refers to that which has passed already, atoning for the sins of the past year. The sages introduced this idea. They say that there were Kohanim Gedolim who took the opportunity, they had the right to be in the Holy of Holies. I shouldn't say the right. A few weeks ago we mentioned Jews, and the Gemara doesn't talk about ideas of rights, they talk about responsibilities. But the Kohen Gadol had the opportunity, the holy opportunity, to actually stand in the Holy of Holies because he had brought the incense and he had caused the smoke, the room to fill with smoke. God appears in the cloud. So he has some time to pray there. and he could pray for what is important for the people. And he would pray for a healthy and blessed year for the entire Jewish people. And we know also the text of some of those prayers, and they've made their way into the piyutim of our machzorim. And God willing, this coming Yom Kippur also, the Kohen Gadol will have the chance to pray these same prayers. He does pray about the future. And then we read about the second half of the parsha. The second half of the parsha is not so connected to Yom Kippur. It's a list of all the forbidden relations that God gave to us. And on the surface, like we see, it doesn't have anything specifically to do with Yom Kippur, but then we think about it, it actually is quite appropriate for Yom Kippur. Why? Because when we have Yom Kippur, we don't do anything. Yom Kippur is all about not doing. All the 39 melachot that we don't do on Shabbat, those are included in the prohibition of Yom Kippur. Plus, we don't engage in the usual acts that define human desires. We don't eat, we don't drink, and we don't engage in physical relations. That is easy for many people to do, at least for one day of the year. Why? Because during the rest of the year, unfortunately, we are human. We are made out of flesh and blood, and we have urges to do things. Sometimes we also have urges to do even, we have other averot. Some people have urges for physical violence and for theft and for causing harm to others. Some people have physical urges, so to speak, to be disrespectful. We are all human. And this parasha teaches us, in no uncertain terms, that God expects more of us in the future. God expects us to know that we can't just do what we want. We cannot go after our eyes and do something just because it's pleasurable. A Jewish person defines his holiness by specifically limiting himself. That is actually the whole theme of this entire book of Vayikra. Limits. Can't go this, can't do that. You can't go into the temple whenever you want. You have to subscribe to the laws of Tumah and Tahara. You have to subscribe to the laws of Kodashim. You have to subscribe to the laws of proper dietary restrictions. We read about that at the beginning. Now we're getting to the other aspects of involving also desires that we have. People have to know that there's limits, and we have to set limits on ourselves. We have to set limits for the future. And God connects this with, interesting enough, the two places where the Jewish people lived the most, the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan. He says, don't do like the Egyptians do, and don't do like the Canaanim do. He doesn't mention don't do like the Babylonians, don't do like the Greeks, don't do like, let's say, the other Semitic groups, don't do like the Ammonites and Moabites, the Bnei Esav, the Ishmaelites, don't do like the whatever other peoples there, don't do like the Ethiopians, and they're also around at the time. He doesn't mention them. He says, don't do like the Canaanim, and don't do like the Egyptians. Why? You used to live among them. You lived among the Egyptians, don't do like them. You lived among the Canaanim, don't do like them. Now, some people have this tendency, they call it reductio ad Hitlerum. They look at what the Canaanim Egyptians did, say, oh, well, the Canaanim and the Egyptians actually, they built roads. They knew construction. They were farmers. They had families sometimes. Should we not do like them? No. You should do the things that specifically defined their cultures. You should not do like the Egyptians in things that were specifically Egyptian. You should not do like the Canaanim in a way that shows you're just like the Canaanim. What defined the Egyptians? The Egyptian definition is that their culture was entirely suffused with avodah zarah, with idolatry and superstition, and it was connected to the Giluy Arayot, the forbidden relations that they would practice. And they also had, the sages tell us that, unfortunately, if you have someone who commits one of the big three sins, he's, let's say, an idolater, you have to assume he also has no problem, let's say, committing adultery or committing bloodshed. And the same is true with the other averot. If you have a person who is okay with shedding blood, he's probably going to do the other two averot. And the same with the other Avirah. And that was what defined Egyptian culture. So the sages say that's what the Egyptians did. They actually legalized certain forms of, even that up until now, the decent Gentile cultures believed were forbidden forms of relations. Certainly marriage was between a man and woman. The Egyptians broke down that barrier. So too, the Canaanim. Canaanite culture actually sanctified the ta'avot, the physical desires. They actually made it a religious aspect. They call it the fertility cult. The Canaanim somehow managed to involve in their avodah zarah, they were able to involve Gilu Arayot to an extent that most nations hadn't thought of, and also forms of Shfichut Hamim, the Molech worship, which involved human sacrifice of children no less, although sometimes they didn't actually practice, they just passed the child through the fire, but many times it seems that they would actually burn children. They were able to somehow take all these Averos and do them all in one shot. They had festivals dedicated to these Averot. That is the specifically Canaanite thing we should avoid. Oh yeah, the Canaanim lived in Eretz Yisrael, we could copy that. It says don't do like the Canaanim, we don't do the things that specifically made them like the Canaanim. It doesn't say, for example, even though eventually our society and culture would come in contact with that of the Greeks and that of the Babylonians and that of the Romans, we weren't specifically told don't be like the Greeks, even though the Greeks were already a nation. They preceded Abraham. We might even have something to learn from them here and there. There's something that you can actually take from Greek culture or the Greek tradition. And we know there were Rishonim who did that. And also from the Babylonian tradition. The sages saw no problem with the fact that the months in our Hebrew calendar are taken from Babylon. Those are the Babylonian names. The old names were something else. It's okay to learn a little bit from them. But there's two groups, specifically the Canaanim and the Egyptians, that we cannot be like them. We should not be like them, we cannot be like them, and it's critical that as a Jewish society we form a new one that is unlike them entirely. We have to technically do away with Canaanite culture. Doesn't mean necessarily destroy the Canaanim, although there is that option. Instead, they were given the option to, before the conquest, they were given the option to just leave the land of Israel or to give up their culture, give up their avodah zarah and their avirot, and accept the 7 Noahide commandments, which would basically nullify their Canaanitism. And there were some who actually did that, even though they didn't become the best Jews in history, but at least they were considered neutralized or kosher for this aspect. We have to know that, we have to avoid that. And perhaps one would say, well, that's very easy because the Jews lived among the Egyptians and the Canaanim. It is not by mistake that God caused it that the Canaanim occupied the land of Israel right immediately before the time of the patriarchs and basically became the rulers of the land right before the Jewish people showed up. God had that for a reason. God basically gives us these people who are so steeped in Averot so that we learn how not to be like them. There's an essay Rabbi Victor Miller has where he says, God gave us terrible role models so we learn how not to be. God gave Jacob an Esav so that he learned not to be like Esav. God gave the Jewish people Canaanim so we know exactly what not to be like. God put us among the Egyptians so we know not how to be exactly like the Egyptians. Don't do like them. And there are, of course, ways that we can ourselves turn into a model for these other nations. We were not put among the Greeks because perhaps there was nothing special there. God did not ordain that. But he did tell us that we have to eventually form a society and become a model for all the other nations to follow. That is something that we can do. First we have to learn, like David HaMelech says, Sur Meira, avoid the bad, V'asei Tov. We're going to get into that next week, Kedoshim. First we have to Sur Meira. We have to erase our sins of the past and we have to atone for them. And then we have to know what not to be like. We have to look at them, at the Canaanim and the Mitzrayim very closely and say, we will not want to be like them. We want to form a society that is totally unlike their society. And then we can now get ready for the future. What can we do? What does God expect of us? What higher standard has God set for the Jewish people in order to act as a role model for the rest of the world? God willing, this week we will be able to learn to put this into practice. And next week we'll discuss that higher standard that God has in store for us. Shabbat Shalom.